Winter, 1944. The Apennine Mountains, Italy. In this brutal, vertical war, the most important man on the battlefield was not the one with the biggest rifle. He was not the general, safe behind a wall of maps. He was not the tank commander, buttoned up inside tons of steel. He was a man with a quiet voice, a 35-pound box of wires, and a target. He was the ouvido e a boca, the ears and the mouth of the army. He was the forward observer, the artillery spotter, and his radio operator. These men, often just a two-man team, were the unsung gods of this war. They would crawl for hours, sometimes for days, through freezing mud and shattered forests to find a single suicidal observation post, a destroyed farmhouse, a rocky crevice, a hole in the snow vorlicking the German lines. They were the ones who, whispering into a handset, could summon the thunder. They were the ones who could turn a whisper into a divine, earth-shattering roar, the sound of an entire artillery battalion of 105 millimeters hidden miles away, all firing at a single coordinate. Their lifeline, their entire reason for existing, was a piece of American-made magic. The -300 Seychelles rupees backpack radio, the walkie-talkie. It was a miracle of technology, one of the first truly portable FM. But this miracle had a fatal flaw. A flaw that, in the Apennine Mountains, turned this multi-thousand-dollar piece of equipment into 35 pounds of useless dead weight. The -300 Seychelles rupees was an FM radio. Its signal, like a beam of light, traveled in a linharetta, line of sight. It was powerful, it was clear, but it could not bend around corners. It could not pass through solid rock. And in the Apennine Mountains, there was nothing but corners and solid rock. The very terrain of the Gothic line was a natural Geology Faraday, a cage that smothered radio signals. Line of sight, the radio's primary requirement, was a cruel joke. The Brazilian command post, with the big artillery guns, was tucked deep in a valley to protect it from German cannons. The German targets, the Lardinium machine gun nests and mortar pits, were deliberately hidden on reverse slopes and in deep ravines, specifically to make them invisible, not just to rifles, but to radios. The Germans were masters of this. They had designed their defenses to defeat Allied doctrine. And the core of Allied doctrine was artillery, coordinated by radio. This is where our story begins. In a frozen shell crater, somewhere near the German stronghold of a two-man team. A Brazilian lieutenant, a forward observer, his binoculars pressed so hard against his face they were freezing to his skin, and his radio operator, a young corporal we will call Gomez. Gomez was not a career soldier. He was a conscript, back in Brazil, perhaps in a quiet suburb of São Paulo or a bustling street in Recife. He was a radioamador, a ham radio operator. He was a tinkerer, a nerd, a man obsessed. His bedroom wasn't filled with pictures of movie stars. It was a bird's nest of copper wires, vacuum tubes, soldering irons, and strange, homemade antennas. In his civilian life, he spent his nights trying to bounce signals off the ionosphere just to hear the faint, crackling voice of a stranger in Argentina, or Portugal, or even Japan. He wasn't trained in war. He was trained in the physics of waves. He knew, better than any field manual, that a radio is just a box. The antenna is the true weapon. For 2 days, Gomez and his lieutenant had been hiding in this icy hole. They had eaten their last cold ration. They had taken turns sleeping, their bodies pressed together for warmth. They were mapping every German position, and now the moment had come. Far below them, a Brazilian infantry platoon from the 6th Infantry Regiment was about to launch a frontal attack on a fortified farmhouse. But in a narrow ravine to the left of that farmhouse, hidden from the platoon's view, Gomez could see it. He could see it clearly through his own binoculars. A full platoon of German Panzergrenadiers with 3 heavy MG-42 is setting up a perfect, devastating L-shaped ambush. If this ambush was not destroyed, the Brazilian attack would not just fail. It would be a massacre. The Prasinhas would walk right into the kill zone, and Lardinha would cut them in half. The lieutenant grabbed the radio handset, his voice tense. "Gomez, get me Canavit." Canavit Pockenknife was the code name for the 105 mm artillery battalion, miles away, safe in their hidden valley. Gomez nodded. He was all business. He unclipped his standard-issue IN 130 whip antenna, a long, flimsy strip of steel, and extended it to its full 10-foot length. He clipped it to the radio's terminal. He put the handset to his ear. He cranked the small hand generator. He spoke the call sign. Canavit, Canavit. This is Fogo. Fogo. Do you copy? Nothing. He heard only a loud, hissing, deafening static. The mountain was in the way. It was a solid, billion-ton wall of granite between his radio and the battalion. The signal was slamming uselessly into the rock, dying just feet from his antenna. He tried again. He angled the antenna. He pointed it left. He pointed it right. Static, static, static. The lieutenant's face was pale. It cooled ear in the valley below. The first faint whistles of the Brazilian NC. The sergeants getting their men ready to move. Gomes, pelo amor de Deus. What is wrong? Gomez didn't need to answer. He knew exactly what was wrong. His signal was a straight line, and the target was around a corner. Doctrine said to relocate, to find higher ground. But there was no higher ground. De were on Italiano, and if they moved from this crater, they would be seen by a dozen German snipers. They were trapped. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the Brazilian infantry would stand up and walk unknowingly into a wall of machine gun fire. And then the worst happened. A German mortar, firing randomly, perhaps spotting a shadow, perhaps just harassing the lines. The shell screamed in. It landed 50 meters away, a deafening crump that showered their hole in rocks and ice. They flinched, pressing their faces into the mud. When Gomez looked up, his heart stopped. A single, razor-sharp piece of shrapnel, no bigger than a finger, had screamed past his helmet and, with a vicious ping, had sheared the top 6 feet of his whip antenna completely off. It was gone. All he had left was a broken, useless, 3-foot stump of metal. The lieutenant stared at it. His face went white. He didn't swear. He just whispered, Meu Deus. It was over. They were completely, totally cut off. Their 35-pound miracle radio was now just 35 pounds of dead weight. The ambush was set. The Brazilians were walking into it, and the gods of war were mute. The lieutenant looked at the broken antenna, then at the distant, vulnerable line of his comrades, and his training failed him. He was a good officer, but his manual had no page for this. He began grabbing extra magazines for his rifle, his movements stiff and angry. Gomez, it's over, he said, his voice grim, tasting like ash pega suahama. We sell our lives dearly. But those men, they are already dead. But Gomez wasn't listening. He wasn't moving for his rifle. It was frozen, but not with fear. His mind was on fire. In this single desperate moment, the Cabo Gomez of the Brazilian army vanished, and the radioamador from São Paulo took over. He was no longer a soldier in a shell crater. He was back in his cluttered garage, his shack, facing a technical challenge. His brain, trained for years to solve signal path problems, was not panicking. It was diagnosing, the radio isn't broken, the transmitter is fine. The battery is fine. The radiator is broken. The antenna is just a piece of metal, a radiator. Any piece of metal, of roughly the right length, could work. He could use his rifle barrel. He could use his bayonet. He could use a strand of barbed wire. But that wouldn't solve the real problem. Even a brand new 10-foot antenna wouldn't solve the real problem. The mountain was still in the way. He looked at the broken 3-foot stump of his antenna. His signal was radiating in all directions, like an unlit light bulb. Most of that precious, life-saving energy was slamming uselessly into a billion tons of granite right behind him. The rest was scattering weakly into the sky. He didn't just need to radiate a signal. He needed to aim it. Like a lens for light, he needed a reflector for the radio waves. He needed to catch all that wasted energy and focus it into a single, tight beam. His eyes, frantic but sharp, darted around the frozen ditch. He saw his rifle, useless, his bayonet, useless, his helmet, too round, too small, his rucksack. And then he saw it. It was half buried in the mud near his pack. His marmita, his mess kit. The standard issue U.S. Army aluminum cook. It was greasy, stained with the black soot of 100 tiny fires and the remnants of his morning coffee, which he'd mixed with snow. The lieutenant, seeing Gomez lunge for his cookpot, was baffled, then furious. Gomez, pelo amor de Deus, this is not the chimi to eat. Gomez ignored him. His mind was racing. He was a tinkerer. He knew this. The cookpot was metal. It was aluminum, a perfect conductor. But more importantly, it was sapé. It was a shallow parabola. It was, in effect, a crude, shallow satellite dish. This was the jeitinho. This was the pure, desperate, brilliant hack. He wasn't just going to replace the antenna. He was going to build a new one, a better one, a directional one, using his garbage. Segura isso, he grunted. Shoving the radio box, achres, lieutenant. He grabbed his K-bar knife and his small signals toolkit. He still had the broken 3-foot stump of the old antenna on his radio. He needed wire. He ripped a foot-length of Fuji Comunicação standard copper telephone wire from his bag. He stripped the ends with his teeth, his fingers numb from the cold. He jammed one bare end of the wire into the broken antenna port on the -300 Seychelles rupees, winding it tight, making a crude but solid connection. Now for the dish. He couldn't just touch the wire to the pot. That would short the signal. He was a ham operator. He knew the theory. He needed to find the focal point. He held the pot in his left hand, like a shield. With his right, he held the bare, stripped end of the copper wire, hovering it just over the center of the pot, maybe an inch or two away, not touching it. He was creating a makeshift Yagi antenna, or more accurately, a contana. The aluminum pot itself would act as the reflector, gathering his radio's weak signal and focusing it into a narrow, powerful beam. The wire itself would be the driven element. It was a piece of electronic improvisation so advanced it wouldn't be seen in standard military hardware for another 20 years. The lieutenant was now speechless, watching his corporal hold a radio in one hand and a dirty cookpot in the other, aiming it into the sky like some kind of strange, religious offering. Gomez ... What in God's name are you doing? Gomez didn't answer. It was timing. He knew the mountain was blocking him from the artillery base. A straight line was impossible, but as a ham radio operator, he knew about bouncing signals. He had done it his whole life. He looked across the valley, past the German-held ridge. He saw it, a different mountain, a sheer, flat, granite rock face, glittering with ice, catching the weak winter sun. It was a giant, natural billboard. He turned his back to his own base. He pointed the opening of the cookpot directly at that flat rock face. He wasn't trying to signal his base. He was trying to signal the rock, hoping to bounce his FM signal around the mountain like a bank shot in pool. Far below, the Brazilian infantry was now in the open. They were moving. They were 30 seconds from the kill zone. De Herman, Emehi 42 ganar suertensing, their fingers taking up the slack on their triggers. Gomez took a deep breath. He held the pot steady. He aimed his gambiarra at the rock face. He cranked the radio's hand generator. He pressed the transmit button and spoke, his voice desperate but clear. Canavit, this is Fogo. Do you copy? Prioridade. Ambush. A deafening, agonizing second of pure, hissing static. The lieutenant closed his eyes, and then a miracle. A sound so faint it was barely a whisper, so distorted it sounded like a ghost, crackled through the handset. ... Goam ... This ... Canavit. Signal weak ... Read. Unreadable. Say again ... It was there. A thread, a connection, but it wasn't enough. The signal was too weak. They couldn't understand him. The infantry was 20 seconds from the trap. Gomez looked at the pot. The connection was unstable. His hand was shaking. He needed a better ground plane. He needed to stabilize the signal, to give the radio waves a clearer push. His eyes darted around. His canteen. He grabbed his canteen, uncapped it, and poured the last of his precious, freezing water into the cook. The lieutenant gasped. Gomez, your water! But Gomez wasn't thirsty. He was working. The water, sloshing in the aluminum pot, would act as a perfect capacitive ground, stabilizing the fluctuating signal. It was an act of pure, unadulterated, genius-level gambiarra. He held the pot steady, the water sloshing inside. He aimed it back at the rock face. He pressed the transmit button again. This time, he didn't ask. Comanded, Kauniveci. This is Fogo Uno. Fire mission. Danger close. Danger close! He screamed the coordinates he had memorized. Grid 349, 9 menos 1. Ambus, entire platoon. Fire for effect. Now, the static broke. A voice, no longer a ghost, but a clear, loud, angry roar, boomed back through the handset, so loud it made Gomez flinch. Fogoon. This is Caniveci. We read you, loud and clear. Message received. Shots out. Get your heads down. I say, Again. Shots. Out. The hack had worked. The cookpot, full of water, had focused and bounced the signal. The gods of war, who had been mute, were now screaming, and the thunder was on its way. For Gomez and the lieutenant, the next few seconds were the longest of their lives. There was no time to celebrate. The voice on the radio had said shots out. That meant the shells were already in the air. They were danger close. The target was just a few hundred meters away from them. Gomez didn't drop the radio. He just lowered his head, pulled his helmet down, and pressed himself against the frozen mud of the crater. The lieutenant did the same. Screaming Kabekabak, he grabbed the handset and yelled into it. Fogo Brayson! They were still exposed. They had just painted a giant kill me sign on their own position by transmitting. The German ambushers, hearing the signal or seeing the antenna, might turn their guns on them. The Brazilian infantry, unaware of the trap or the call for fire, were still moving forward, confused by their NCO's frantic whistles to get down. They were caught in that terrible, naked moment between advancing and taking cover. And then, it came. It did not come as a single boom. It came as a sound that defies words. It was the sound of the sky being ripped in half just above their heads. A high-pitched, terrifying, accelerating scream of 12 105mm high-explosive shells, all arriving at the same precise coordinate at the same precise second. The Canavit battalion had fired everything they had. The shells, weighing 33 pounds each, slammed into the hidden German ravine. The world erupted. Gomez and the lieutenant, just a few hundred meters away, were not just thrown by the explosion, they were lifted. The ground bucked and heaved like a living animal. A wall of superheated air, pulverized rock, and shrapnel blasted over their heads. The sound of physical, concussive weight that punched the air from their lungs and felt like it would collapse their chests. It was not a sound. It was a physical blow. The perfect barrage had landed. It had landed directly, squarely, and catastrophically on top of the entire German Panzergrenadier platoon. Through the ringing in their ears and the dust filling their mouths and eyes, they dared to peek over the edge of the crater. Where there had been a rocky ravine with 3 camouflaged MG-42s setting up a perfect kill zone, there was now just ... a hole. A smoking, black, pulverized hole in the earth. The farmhouse rubble the Germans had been using for cover was gone. The trees that had lined the ravine were gone, reduced to splintered, burning toothpicks. The earth itself was on fire. The ambush had not been suppressed. It had not been neutralized. It had been deleted. It had been erased from the battlefield in less than 3 seconds of concentrated industrial violence. There was no return fire, no single, defiant shot, no screams, only silence. A profound, smoking, chemical silence. Far below, the Brazilian infantry platoon, who had just dropped to the ground in confusion, were now staring, awestruck, at the column of black smoke rising from the ravine they had been about to walk past. They didn't know the details. They couldn't. They only knew one thing. 1 second, they were advancing toward a quiet line of trees. The next, the world exploded in a way they had never seen. And then, the machine guns that were supposed to kill them were quiet. They had been saved, not by a rifle, not by a grenade, but by a ghost, by a whisper from a god they couldn't see. In the shell crater, the lieutenant was shaking, not from fear, but from a profound, vibrating shock. His body was trying to process the sheer, unnatural violence he had just witnessed, and the impossible cause of it all. He looked at Gomez. Gomez was still holding the cookpot, the dirty water still sloshing inside, the handset still pressed to his ear. He looked like a madman, a shaman holding a sacred relic. The lieutenant, a man trained in the precise, logical, grid-square world of military doctrine, had just witnessed a miracle. He had just seen a man stop a massacre, ... with a cook and a canteen full of water. He started to laugh. A high-pitched, hysterical, uncontrollable laugh of pure, released tension. Gomez, the lieutenant said, his voice cracking, tears mixing with the dirt on his face. What was that? Gomez, the radioamador, finally lowered the pot. He was breathing heavily, the adrenaline fading, his hands now starting to shake. Refletor parabolico tenant, he probably said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. A parabolic reflector, a radio's antenna, it wastes energy. It radiates in all directions, like a bare bulb. The pot. It catches the signal, it focuses Italiano, like the silver part behind the bulb in a flashlight. It makes a beam. He then pointed with his chin at the distant, glittering rock face across the valley. And that mountain? That was our mirror. We couldn't go through the enemy, so we went around. It was a perfect, elegant solution born not from a billion-dollar laboratory, but from a lifetime of tinkering, of making do, of endless, patient nights in a garage, trying to hear a voice from halfway around the world. This was the core of the jeitinho. This was the hack in its purest form. Gomez hadn't just saved his platoon. He had, in that moment, defeated the Apennine. He had defeated the laws of physics. He had defeated the German ambush. And he had done it all with his lunchbox. The lieutenant grabbed the handset from Gomez. His voice was no longer desperate. It was steady. It was cold. It was the voice of a man who was back in control. Canavit, this is Fogawam. Good effect on target. Excelente effect on target. We are moving to observe the objective. Out. He clipped the handset back. He looked at Gomez, not as a superior officer to a subordinate, but with a new, raw, almost fearful respect. Jamayo, he might have said, using the affectionate nickname. Don't ever clean that pot. Gomez simply nodded. He poured out the now precious water, which had served its purpose. He carefully coiled his copper wire. He strapped the standard, broken, useless stump of an antenna back onto his radio, as if nothing had happened, and he clipped his greasy, battle-scarred cookpot back onto his rucksack. It was, once again, just a pot. But for 3 minutes, it had been the single most important piece of communications technology on the entire Italian front. The infantry platoon, now understanding they had been saved, began their advance into the smoking silence. They moved with a new confidence. They knew something the Germans didn't. They knew their gods were watching, and they knew their gods were fast. The ambush was broken. The path was clear. And it was all thanks to a hack that no manual could ever teach. The story of what happened in that shell crater should have become a legend. It should have been studied at Fort Benning, at West Point, at every Signal Corps school in the world. But it wasn't, because how could it be? After the infantry took the farmhouse, after the battle was won and the cost was counted, Gomez and his lieutenant walked back to the command post. The lieutenant, covered in grime and still vibrating from the experience, had to file his after-action report. He would have sat down with a piece of paper, or in front of a type. The blank form would ask, action taken, disposition of enemy, results. What could he write? He was a professional officer. He was part of a chain of command. He could not, in any official military document, write the truth. He could not write. My radio operator, Corporal Gomez, used his aluminum cookpot as a parabolic reflector, filled it with water to create a capacitive ground, and bounced an FM signal off a mountain, saving the entire 6th Regiment. They would not have promoted Gomez. They would have sent him for a psychiatric evaluation. They would have assumed the lieutenant was suffering from shell shock. The story was, by its very nature, unreportable. So, the lieutenant did what any good officer would do. He lied. He wrote, engaged enemy strongpoint at grid 349. Advance to objective. It was the truth. But it was not the whole truth. The how was erased. The official record, the first draft of history, noted a routine, successful artillery mission. The hack was, by its very nature, invisible. The Jeep mortar, as crude as it was a physical object. You could see it, touch it, photograph it. It was undeniable. But Gomez's hack, it was a moment of pure, intangible brilliance. It was a whisper of physics. The moment he packed his copper wire and dumped the water, the evidence was gone. The cookpot on his rucksack was just a cookpot again. The radio was just a radio. The only proof was the smoking, annihilated German ravine, the stunned, permanent memory of his lieutenant. We can imagine the lieutenant trying to explain it later, back at the officers' mess, his hands shaking as he held a drink. You won't believe what my radio man did today, he'd say. He used his meta ... his cook to call in the barrage. The other officers, trained in the hard, cold, predictable science of war, would have laughed. Good one, Tenant. He used his cookpot. What's next? Did the cook kill a tiger tank with a frying pan? We all have our foxhole fantasies. The story was too absurd. It sounded like a soldier's tall tale, a fantasy born from the stress and adrenaline of combat. It was easier to believe in a miracle than in a cookpot antenna. And so, the cookpot hack remained a secret. A legend shared only between Gomez and his lieutenant. It was their private victory, but it changed them. For the rest of their time on the line, that two-man team operated with a terrifying new confidence. They became the FEB's secret weapon. They would volunteer for the impossible observation posts, the ones in the deepest radio-dead zones, the spots that other teams had declared unworkable. The command probably thought they were just incredibly brave, or perhaps suicidal. They didn't know that Gomez was carrying a secret that made the mountains irrelevant. He would be out there, night after night, his greasy aluminum pot in his hand, painting the German lines with invisible beams of focused radio waves. He would bounce signals off sheer rock faces, off the surface of frozen lakes, perhaps even off the metallic shell of a destroyed tank. He was no longer just a radio operator. He was a sniper, but his weapon wasn't a rifle. It was the electromagnetic spectrum, and his jeitinho was the scope. This was a level of improvisation that the enemy simply could not comprehend. The Germans were masters of defense. Their entire Gothic line was built on the known, predictable rules of war. They placed their bunkers to defeat line of sight. They placed their ambushes to exploit radio-dead zones. They knew, with absolute certainty, that a ravine with a mountain behind it was safe. They were playing chess, but Gomez was not. He was playing a different game, a game with rules he was making up as he went along. He was using a Brazilian solution on a German problem. This is the very essence of the jeitinho. It is not just about making do. It is not just a hack. It is a philosophy. It is the refusal to accept that a problem is impossible. It is the belief that any system, no matter how complex, be it a radio, an army, or the laws of physics, can be bent to your will. It is the creative disobedience that sees a field manual not as a holy book, but as a suggestion. This single moment highlights the fundamental cultural difference between the armies. The American doctrine was built on overwhelming the problem with resources. The American radio operator, finding his antenna broken, would have followed his training. He would have reported the equipment failure and retreated to get a new one. The system provides. The German doctrine was built on defeating the problem with precision. The German operator would have had a perfectly engineered, factory-sealed spare antenna in his kit. The plan provides. The Brazilian operator, finding his antenna broken, had a different set of instructions. His instructions were cultural. The manual is a suggestion. The plan will fail. The system won't provide. You must solve it. Use your brain. Use what you have. The individual provides. Gomez's hack was never duplicated. It couldn't be. It wasn't a thing like the Jeep. It was a skill. It was the unique, unteachable intersection of one man's specific civilian hobby and his desperate wartime need. It was the radioamador inside the soldier. It was a moment of pure, unrepeatable genius. And because it was unrepeatable, it was never documented. Because it was undocumented, it was officially forgotten. A ghost in the machine of war. And then, the spring of 1945 came. The Gothic line, that fortress of mountains, finally broke. The Brazilians and their allies, in a massive, coordinated offensive, shattered the German defenses. The war spilled out of the high altitudes, down from the icy peaks, and onto the flat, open Po Valley. The fighting changed overnight. It was no longer a slow, vertical crawl, a war of inches fought against machine guns hidden in rock. It suddenly became a horizontal race, a war of miles, fought with tanks, trucks, and speeding jeeps. And with that single, strategic shift, the Cookpot Antenna hack, that brilliant, desperate, and beautiful solution, became instantly obsolete. The moment the army was on flat ground, line of sight was no longer a problem. The standard-issue 10-foot whip antennas worked perfectly. They could easily reach the command posts miles away across the flat terrain. The miracle was no longer necessary. The cookpot was just a cookpot again. It was a perfect key for an impossible lock, and now the door had been blown off its hinges. Just a few weeks later, on May 2, 1945, the German forces in Italy signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was finished. The fighting stopped. The silence that fell over the Apennine Mountains was absolute. Gomez, along with the other 25,000 Persinas, waited for the ships to take them home. He packed his bag. He packed his radio, which was now just a heavy box of components. And he packed his greasy, soot-stained cookpot. It was, after all, his. He returned to Brazil. He landed in Rio de Janeiro, handed in his equipment, his rifle, his helmet. He received his discharge papers, his final pay, and a handshake. It was no longer Ciabeo Gomez. He was just Gomez again. He didn't go to military academies. He didn't write a training manual on improvised signal reflection in mountainous terrain. He didn't give lectures on advanced radio theory. He didn't receive a medal for his ingenuity. How could he? The act was never recorded. It existed only in his memory and in the memory of his lieutenant, who was probably just as happy to forget the entire terrifying ordeal. So, Gomez just wendome. He went back to São Paulo, or Recife, or whatever small, sun-drenched town. His cluttered workshop was waiting for him, and he went back to his real life. He went back to being a radioamador. He probably got a job as an electrician, or a radio repairman, or maybe he opened his own small shop fixing electronics. He was a civilian. But at night, he was back in his element. He was in his garage, his shack, surrounded once again by a bird's nest of copper wires, glowing vacuum tubes, and the familiar, comforting smell of hot soldering iron. He was once again trying to bounce signals, not off mountains to save a platoon, but off the ionosphere, just to hear the faint, crackling, magical voice of a stranger in Argentina, or Portugal, or Japan. He was a tinkerer again. He was himself. And perhaps in a dusty corner of that workshop, sitting on a wooden shelf next to jars of screws and old capacitors, sat a greasy, battered, standard-issue aluminum. It was probably filled with loose screws, or old wires, or maybe he just used it as an ashtray while he worked. His wife, if he had won, might have tried to throw it out a dozen times. Por que você guarda essa marmita velha e suja? Why do you keep this old dirty pot? It's useless. And he would just smile and shrug and say it was poor sort. For luck, how could he ever explain it to her? How could he make her, or anyone, understand that inside that simple 10-cent piece of aluminum he saw the pale, terrified face of his lieutenant, that he heard the deafening, world-ending roar of an entire artillery battalion screaming out of the sky, that he could still see the black, smoking column of an annihilated German ambush, a grave he had dug with radio waves. That pot wasn't a piece of garbage. It was a trophy. It was the physical proof of a single, brilliant moment when his civilian passion became more powerful than a military doctrine. It was the symbol of a day when a tinkerer, a hobbyist, a man who loved to play with wires, became the most important soldier on the entire Italian front. Gomez's name is not on any monument. His story is not in any manual. His hack was a ghost, a whisper of physics that saved dozens, perhaps hundreds, of lives and then vanished. But it is the perfect, shining example of the jeitinho in its purest form. It wasn't about being a soldier, it was about being a problem solver. It's the story of a tinkerer who was forced to go to war, and for one desperate, brilliant moment, proved that the most powerful weapon on the battlefield isn't always a gun. Sometimes, it's a good idea, and a cookpot.